Imagine you have a time machine and you could travel back in time and witness the city of Rome in different time periods, in its different stages of evolution. In 320 AD, for instance, not long after the historical battle between Maxentius and Constantine, you would have found Rome at its peak. Around that time, the city had reached its full extent of impressive buildings, meaning that the last grandiose imperial buildings had been finished, begun by the Emperor Maxentius. Around 1 million people lived in Rome during those days, and the city must have been utterly impressive, with beautiful temples and grandiose buildings stretching as far as the horizon. Then you decide to travel forward with your time machine to the year 405 AD, and you are surprised to still find the city in an absolutely splendorous state. While slightly less people were living in Rome in that year than 85 years before, maybe around 800,000 people, the city was still unspoiled and beautiful, not having been sacked even once in 800 years. You would find the old temples all intact, beautiful ornamentation, gilded statues atop high columns in the Forum Romanum, then the grandiose Flavian amphitheater in pristine condition, the large Colossus nearby, the Circus Maximus, the Septizodium, the huge baths, and other incredible wonders of architecture, all absolutely intact. And then you decide to travel forward another 85 years to the year 490 AD. Now you find the city changed. There are much less people on the streets than the last two times. Some of the buildings in the outlying parts of the city are showing signs of neglect. Many buildings, many of the old insulae are standing empty. Then you wander to the city center, the old Forum area. You expect the same bleak picture of neglect, but to your surprise, you find the old buildings still intact and in good shape. At least on the outside, they are being repaired and maintained so that they still evoke a reaction of awe and wonder. Yes, some statues are missing here and there. Yes, some of the ornaments are missing. Yes, some of the buildings are only nice looking on the outside. But in general, all the buildings in the central area, which you had seen in 320 or in 405 AD, are still there. And then you remember why. Because counterintuitively, the king Theodoric, who now ruled over these lands, officially as the representative of the Roman emperor in Constantinople, he took great care of the old monuments and spent a considerable amount of the tax revenue in order to repair the old monuments and even to protect the countless statues in the city. Therefore, to your surprise, the city does not look as if it had fallen. Yes, the 3 sacks of the 5th century certainly left their marks, and there were even less people present now, possibly only 200 to 150,000, and yet still, Rome was still very impressive. So then you decide to use your time machine again and travel forward another 85 years to the year 575. You fully expect a not much worse state than you found in 490 AD. For was Rome now not part of the Roman Empire again? Was Rome now not reunited, again ruled by the emperor at Constantinople, as it had been 200 years before in the times of Constantine or Theodosius? So this Rome surely would look more impressive now than it had 85 years before. The emperors at Constantinople surely had rebuilt the old city of their forefathers. They surely revered the city which had built their whole empire, which Constantinople had but inherited from Rome. But in 575 AD, you would find utter desolation. Now the streets were completely empty. Barely any people were left at all. You would only find a meager rest of some 30,000 people, cowered together near the Tiber River in a small area near the Campus Martius, impoverished and miserable, while the whole rest of this vast city lay completely empty and abandoned. The buildings were crumbling left and right. Collapsed columns were lying on some of the empty streets, even in the Forum area. The decay started to creep in. Even there the buildings could not be maintained anymore and started to show more and more neglect. A collapsed column would be left here on the street. A fallen statue would be taken and put up in a private residence there. An old collapsed temple looted for building material here. An inferior wooden shack built into an old Roman building there. In short, in 575 AD, the city of Rome would paint an utterly bleak picture when even in 490 AD it had still looked remarkably well preserved. What had happened? Well, the Gothic Wars had happened. That series of devastating wars had happened that had been unleashed by the Eastern Roman Empire, which had destroyed not only the Ostrogothic kingdom, but which had left so many cities in Italy completely desolated and whole areas depopulated. A war which had destroyed most of the old Roman institutions and which had plunged Italy into darkness. From 536 to 562 AD, for 26 insanely long years, Italy was plunged into a seemingly never-ending war. And then the darkness of the year 536 AD, the following crop failures and famine, and then the plague had ravaged Italy even more. Rome had changed sides 5 times, being besieged, sacked, taken, retaken, and so on and so forth for 5 times in that insane conflict. And there was neither money nor the interest to repair the old venerable city after the Gothic Wars. But what if all that had never happened? What if you could use your time machine to create a new timeline to stop this insane war? How would the world have looked if the Gothic Wars had never happened? Let us imagine now that for whatever reason the Emperor Justinian would in this new timeline here not order his extraordinarily talented general Belisarius to conquer the Ostrogothic kingdom in 535 AD. Maybe you would have intervened, and you might have been very convincing, showing yourself to the emperor in the middle of the night with your time machine, convincing him that it would be a very bad idea to oppose you, since you possess some extraordinary technology. Or maybe the emperor in that alternate timeline would have a slightly different character, and instead would choose to consolidate his rule over the newly conquered Vandal territory in Africa. Or the pro-Roman queen Amalasuntha would not have been murdered by her cousin Theodahad. In either case, the Gothic War would then probably not have happened. Naturally, of course, the Ostrogothic kingdom would have been left as it was. So then, would this mean that we would see a very different Italy today? Well, if that devastating war had not happened, the first immediate effect would have been that the old Roman institutions would continue to exist. The office of Western Roman consul would not have been ended by Justinian. In our timeline, the last Western Roman consul was Decius Paulinus of the old illustrious house of the Decii in 534 AD. But in our new alternate timeline, the office of consul would have of course continued. And not only the office of consul, but the ancient office of Roman senator would of course also have continued, since Justinian would now have had no jurisdiction in Rome, and so he would not have been able to abolish that old ancient order which had stood in Rome for over 1200 years by that time, and which in our timeline would for the last time be traced to the year 608 AD, and then not long later vanish forever. But in that alternate universe here, of course, the office of senator would continue. And so would the other Roman institutions and also the art of rhetoric and writing in Latin, as would the office of praetorian prefect. In short, the old Roman institutions, which had been established in the time of the Roman Republic, would continue to exist far longer than in our timeline. And if you are like me, a total Rome nerd, or Romaboo as some people like to say, and I think that you are, or else you probably wouldn't be watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, And with this link, you can now even get a 20% rebate for every purchase. I repeat, a 20% price reduction for every purchase from the SPQR Shop, which is just an absolutely insane offer. And you can only get it here via the Maiorianus link, because let me tell you, the people from SPQR Shop also are absolute fans of the heroic Emperor Maiorian. So go and check out their incredible assortment. There will be certainly also something for you. Now, of course, the cold event of 536 AD, in which the sun was darkened due to one or possibly multiple volcanic eruptions, and in which the global temperatures declined, would still have happened. Therefore, the famines would still have happened, as would have very likely also the plague, which started around 541 AD. However, the people would not have been weakened as much by a continuous brutal war, and therefore their immune systems would probably have fared on average better. This means that maybe not as many people would have died in Italy as in our timeline, but many would still have perished, of course, and therefore there still would have been a noticeable population drop in the 540s. But of course, the most dramatic effect of the Gothic Wars not happening, you would have seen in the cities of Italy. There would not have been this dramatic effect which caused many of the old cities to be almost completely abandoned and to afterwards fall into decay. Therefore, the city of Rome, for instance, in this alternate reality, would have looked probably not much worse, say in 580 AD, as compared to, for example, 520 AD. In our timeline, there would have been a huge difference visible between those two dates, but in this timeline here, you would not have noticed such a dramatic effect. Of course, you would have also noticed less people because of the plague, but not to such an extreme extent as in our timeline. Also, the buildings, of course, would not have been damaged so badly in the long war, and so the funds to continue repairs would of course still continue. And therefore, in that continued Ostrogothic kingdom, you would then still find the old buildings repaired and the old statues protected, possibly even in the late 500s or even in the 600s AD. Then the aqueducts of Rome, which were cut in our timeline in 537 during the first siege of Rome in the Gothic Wars, would continue working, and so consequently would also the baths. You could then visit the old baths of Caracalla or of Diocletian in Rome even in 590 or 640 AD. Another interesting effect that we probably would have observed is the merging of the Gothic and the Roman culture. We only have to look to the Visigothic kingdom in order to see what probably would have happened. In the Visigothic kingdom, namely, there was still a quite strong distinction to be found between Romans and Goths, and especially between the Romans and the Gothic nobility, in the mid-400s in the early Visigothic kingdom. But by the late 600s and early 700s, not long before the Visigothic kingdom was conquered by the Muslim Caliphate, that distinction had all but vanished. You would not be able to tell anymore if that nobleman was a Goth or a Roman. And so we would very likely have witnessed the same thing happening in the Ostrogothic kingdom. The Romans and the Goths would possibly have mingled to a large extent, and a new Romano-Gothic identity might have emerged, based on a combination of Roman and Gothic traditions. Of course, it is entirely possible that the office of emperor would have been resurrected at some point. If the distinction between Romans and Goths would have vanished, then a Romano-Gothic king might have decided to call himself emperor again, and even rule from Rome. This is not entirely unthinkable. We might even have seen the resurgence of some form of mini-Western Romano-Gothic empire of some sort, where the Visigothic and Ostrogothic realms would have been united. This would have been a very powerful player in the European landscape of Germanic kingdoms, possibly becoming even more powerful than the Franks and managing to conquer territories from the Franks and the Alemanni. If that state would have survived for long periods of time, then the European political landscape of today would look completely different. Of course, another effect would have been that the Lombards would not have invaded Italy in that alternate timeline. So therefore, Italy would not have been fragmented, something which would prove to have strong consequences for Italy for over 1,000 years in our timeline. But here, this would not have happened, and Italy would have seen a very homogeneous continuous rule. Now, would there have been war with the Franks at some point? We certainly can imagine that the growing aggression of the Franks in this alternate timeline would have been met with united resistance by a combined Ostrogothic and Visigothic army, even if the two states would not have merged. In our timeline, with the Ostrogothic kingdom gone, the Visigoths had to fight the Franks and later the Muslim Caliphate on their own, but in this timeline the expansion of the Franks might have been halted, and therefore the large empire of Charlemagne would probably not have happened. And please consider supporting this channel via Patreon or YouTube membership, because I really need your help in order to be able to continue this work on late Roman history. Without your support, I don't know how much longer I can continue this channel, because as you can imagine, the YouTube algorithm does not exactly push a niche topic such as late Roman history. Thank you very much. There would not have been a crowning of Charlemagne at Rome in 800 AD, because the popes would not have asked the Franks for help against the Lombards, since the Lombards would have never invaded, as we said. By 800 AD though, it is very likely that the old Roman buildings in Rome and other cities would still have started to crumble. This happened also in the Visigothic kingdom due to the practice of spolia. Whenever there was an earthquake, for example, so that an old Roman building would collapse, the building materials would be reused for the erection of new buildings. And so in our alternate timeline, Rome, in this continued Ostrogothic kingdom of 800 AD, would also start to look medieval. Yes, it would be in better shape than in our timeline in 800 AD, with more of the old monuments intact, but they would still have fallen into decay at some point, because of repeated earthquakes and Tiber River floodings. We can only speculate if the baths would have still worked in that alternate universe in 800 AD. Maybe some still would have. And we can also only wonder for how long the office of senator or consul would have still continued. These offices also vanished at some point in the Eastern Roman Empire in our timeline, so it is reasonable to assume that they too would have vanished at some point in the Middle Ages, or maybe only survived in name as honorary titles in this alternate continued Ostrogothic kingdom. The Latin language would have also continued diverging, and in this Ostrogothic state a different form of Italian would have emerged, which would sound different to our ears than what we understand as Italian. Something like an Italian state would have probably still emerged at some point, competing against the Frankish kingdom and against the German kingdom, possibly fighting wars, taking or losing territory. Possibly with help of the Ostrogoths. The Visigoths would have maybe not been conquered by the Caliphate in the early 700s. The Ostrogoths would likely have sent help and defeated the Muslim armies even before they could have advanced into the Frankish kingdom. Therefore, the state of Spain would have also been very different from the state of Spain in our timeline. More time would have passed and we would get into the modern age. This different Italian state would have certainly been much more powerful than in our timeline. Now, how the relationship to the later Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire would have been, we can only speculate about. Maybe it would have been better than in our timeline, or maybe a war with Byzantium would have happened sooner or later. This would have depended, for instance, on the religious policy of the Romano-Gothic kings or emperors, and if the schism between the Eastern and Western Church would have been as strong as in our timeline. But it is conceivable that there would have been timelines where these Italians would have sent much more help to the Eastern Romans against the Ottoman Empire. Maybe the Crusades would not have sacked Constantinople in 1204 if the ties between Romano-Gothic Italy and Byzantium would have been strong enough. Maybe even Constantinople would not have fallen. The Eastern Roman Empire might have also been in a stronger position had it not invaded the Ostrogothic kingdom in 535, because these over 20 years of war had put a huge strain on the finances of the empire, as well as on the manpower of the army. A more consolidated Roman Empire would not have had to fight so many enemies on so many different fronts, and therefore might have actually stood a better chance against the Muslim invasions. The devastating war with Persia might have been won much sooner by the Eastern Romans and might not have been as devastating had the empire not been so overstretched. And therefore, maybe, paradoxically, the Eastern Roman Empire would have been far larger and maybe in a better position in the year 1200 in that alternate reality than in our timeline. Maybe it might have even stood a chance to survive into our time as some sort of modern nation state. And it might be that many of the old monuments of Rome would be in better shape in that alternate reality. We probably would have a few more of the old buildings still preserved at Rome than we have in our timeline. So we see a world in which the Gothic Wars had never happened might look utterly and completely different in many regards. Of course, it is impossible to tell what would have happened, so your guess is as good as mine. But it would certainly be a fascinating world, which would likely surprise us in many ways. Let me know your ideas for that alternate timeline in the comments section. And I wanted to announce that I'll be on vacation for 2 weeks over Christmas, my first off time from the channel in 2 years since I started the channel, so there won't be as many uploads in that time. I really apologize. But don't worry, as soon as I'm back, of course, I'll immediately continue working on the videos. I will re-upload some of the older videos though, because judging from the views, many of you have never seen them. I wish you all a Merry Christmas and already a Happy New Year, dear friends of Roman history. All the best for you and your loved ones. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. It is only thanks to the amazing patrons and YouTube members of this channel that I can continue making videos about the late Roman Empire. I really want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. And if you want to learn more about the state of the city of Rome right before the Gothic Wars, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about the state of the city of Rome immediately after the Gothic Wars, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.